Paige Mercer stood in the middle of an industrial kitchen 3 times the size of her apartment, staring at dozens of perfectly plated dishes lined up on the steel counter. Her work, but her name was nowhere to be found. On the other side of the kitchen door, laughter, the clink of champagne glasses, the smooth drift of jazz. The Ashford family's biggest gala of the year was in full swing, and she was supposed to be out there, as an invited guest. She looked down at herself. Jeans, a white button-up shirt. She had been told tonight would be simple, intimate, nothing formal. But through the gap in the kitchen door, she saw the grand hall crystal chandeliers, floor-length gowns, tuxedos, diamonds glittering everywhere. There was nothing simple about any of this. She had been set up, and that wasn't even the worst part. On the counter, the menu had been changed. The 2 signature dishes she had spent 3 days creating were gone, replaced by bland, forgettable plates, the kind her boss would serve when Paige wasn't behind the stove. They didn't just want her out of the ballroom. They wanted to erase her from the kitchen. The door swung open. A server looked her up and down and asked, "Are you the new dishwasher?" Before Paige could answer, the door opened again, and the man who walked in was not staff. Beckett Ashford, the man this entire city knew better than to stand across from. He didn't look at her clothes, didn't look at her shoes. He looked straight at her and said one thing: "This dinner is yours. You should be out there." Then he held the door open and waited. But the story didn't begin here. It began 2 weeks earlier, in a much smaller kitchen, where Paige Mercer was cooking meal number 100 for someone who would never be able to taste it again. If Paige's story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next, because the best part is always ahead. 1 week before that gala night, the basement of the Ashford Grand Hotel was so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard clearly. The room had no windows, only a long table made of black oak, and 6 men sitting with their backs straight in their chairs. No one spoke. No one looked at one another. Every pair of eyes was fixed in one direction, on the man seated at the head of the table. Beckett Ashford turned each page of the file in front of him slowly, as if he had the entire day, and as if no one in that room deserved to make him hurry. On his right was Neil Grady, his closest lieutenant, the only man in the room who didn't look afraid, because he had grown used to this kind of air a long time ago. Beckett folded the file shut, set it down on the table, then looked at the man seated across from him. The manager of Onyx nightclub, one of the Ashford family's legitimate front businesses. The man swallowed, both hands resting on his thighs, trying to keep them from shaking and failing. Beckett spoke in an ordinary voice, neither raised nor lowered, flat as the tabletop in front of him. 6 months ago, I sat in this exact seat and told you that it was a second chance. I also made it very clear that there wouldn't be a third. The man opened his mouth, trying to explain something about the numbers, about the circumstances, about a mistake that hadn't been intentional. Beckett lifted his right hand, only a small gesture, light as though he were brushing dust from the shoulder of his jacket. The man fell silent in the middle of his sentence, the words swallowed back into his throat. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Beckett turned to Neil, his voice still unchanged. "Close Onyx. He's out of the city before tomorrow morning." There were no questions. No one asked for more time. No one dared look at the man who had just been sentenced. The manager stood, his legs slightly unsteady, his face bloodless, then walked out of the room in silence. The door closed behind him, and everyone in that room understood that out of the city before tomorrow morning wasn't a suggestion. Beckett rose, adjusted the sleeve of his suit jacket, buttoned it, then walked out of the room without looking back at anyone. His steps were even and slow, as if what had just happened was only one small item on today's schedule that had now been crossed off. Neil followed behind him, keeping just enough distance. When the 2 men reached the hallway, Beckett's personal assistant was already waiting. "Mr. Ashford, your mother just called. She wants to discuss next week's gala dinner." Beckett stopped, and for the first time since he had walked into the basement, something on his face changed. Not much. Not obviously, but enough for Neil, who had walked beside him for more than 10 years, to recognize it. The lines around his eyes softened a little. When he spoke, his voice was still brief, but it carried an entirely different shade, warmer, gentler, as if the man who had just ordered a traitor exiled and the man preparing to take his mother's phone call were 2 completely different people. "Put her through," Beckett said, then reached out and took the phone from his assistant. He placed it to his ear and continued down the hallway. his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. And somewhere in this city, in a cramped little kitchen on the other side of town, Paige Mercer was bent over an old notebook with a worn spine, writing one more line of a new recipe, not yet knowing that it would change everything. In the Lumiere restaurant kitchen, at almost midnight, only a single light was still on. Paige stood at the steel counter, her hands moving quickly as she put each ingredient back into its proper place, checking one last time the menu she had spent the entire week perfecting for the Ashford family's charity gala. 7 courses. She had tested every dish at least 4 times before deciding it was finished. Every sauce she seasoned until the flavor reached that exact threshold she could feel, but couldn't explain in words. She wiped her hands on a towel, stepped back, and looked at the entire handwritten menu pinned beside the stove. This wasn't just a meal. This was the best thing she had ever made. The sound of heels striking the tile floor echoed from the back door. Genevieve Cross stepped inside, her hair still flawless even though it was nearly 12 o'clock at night, her coat draped over her shoulders as if she had just returned from another party. She stopped beside the counter, glanced over the menu, then looked at the ingredients Paige had already prepared. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she nodded. Good. Just one word, but Paige knew that was the highest praise Genevieve gave anyone. Genevieve picked up the menu, skimmed it once more, then set it back down. Tomorrow I have a television interview at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I can't go to the Ashford Hotel. Paige had known this before Genevieve said it, because whenever there was a camera, Genevieve always chose the camera. You'll go in my place, Genevieve continued. Check the kitchen, inspect the ingredients, make sure everything meets the standard. Paige nodded. Genevieve stepped closer, lowering her voice. It wasn't quite a whisper, but it carried the kind of weight Paige had heard far too many times. You represent my brand, Paige. My brand. Go in, do the work, then leave. Don't attract attention. Don't let anyone remember your face more than they remember my name. Paige said nothing, not because she agreed, but because she had heard things like that for 3 years and knew that answering wouldn't change anything. Genevieve looked at her for another moment, as if wanting to be certain the message had landed clearly enough, then turned and walked out. The sound of her heels faded away, the door shut, and the kitchen returned to its familiar silence. Paige stood there a little longer, looking at the menu on the wall. 7 courses. Every one of them was hers. But when the gala night came, the name on everything would be Genevieve Cross. She turned off the light, locked the kitchen, then drove her old car across the city toward the south side, where the streets were narrower, the streetlights burned a deeper yellow, and no one knew she was the one behind the menu of a 2-star Michelin restaurant. Paige's apartment was so small that the kitchen and the living room were one and the same. She set her bag down and turned on the single light above the stove. The pale yellow glow fell across the wall, where an old photograph was pinned. In the photograph, a woman stood in a kitchen even smaller than this one, smiling, holding a wooden spoon, and behind her was a chalkboard with the names of the dishes she had dreamed of selling when she opened her own little restaurant. Her mother. That little place never had the chance to open. Paige washed her hands, opened the drawer, and took out a small notebook with a worn brown leather cover. This notebook was the only thing her mother had left behind, besides the photograph on the wall. The first 17 pages were in her mother's handwriting. Blue ink faded with time, each page a recipe. Each recipe marked with a little note in the margin written in that slightly slanted script. Paige knew by heart every stroke of it. The remaining pages belonged to Paige. She had continued writing in this notebook from the day her mother died. 1 new recipe to a page, each page marked with a date. Nearly 120 pages now. Tonight, Paige cooked a small dish for herself. Not an experiment, not something for anyone else to taste. Just a bowl of noodles made the way her mother used to make them for her on rainy nights when she was little. She sat down at the old wooden table, the steaming bowl in front of her, the kitchen silent. Her eyes came to rest on the photograph on the wall. I'm almost done with the 100th recipe, Mom, she said softly. No one answered, but Paige kept speaking, because she did this every night, because if she stopped talking, she was afraid the emptiness in this kitchen would swallow her whole. She finished the bowl of noodles, washed the dish, closed the notebook, then turned off the light. Tomorrow morning she would go to the Ashford Grand Hotel, stepping into a world completely different from her own, a world where she didn't belong. But tonight, in this cramped little kitchen, she was still the daughter of the woman in the photograph. And that, at least for now, was enough. The next morning, Paige arrived at the Ashford Grand Hotel at 9 o'clock. The building rose higher than anything on the south side where she lived, its glass face reflecting the whole sky as if it owned the city above it, too. Paige walked through the main lobby, where everything was marble and softened light, then turned into the rear entrance for staff, following the directions from the receptionist. She didn't belong in the front lobby. She knew that, and she didn't mind. She was here for the kitchen. The hotel's industrial kitchen was larger than the entire floor space of Lumiere Restaurant. Gleaming steel counters, a ventilation system running quietly, industrial refrigerators lined up along the wall. Paige opened the ingredient list she had brought with her and began checking each storage area one by one, comparing everything against the 7-course menu. She opened every box, smelled every spice, touched every cut of meat to check its freshness. While she was inspecting them, she noticed that several ingredients weren't the kind she had requested. The olive oil was the wrong label. The sea salt had been replaced with industrial salt. The butter didn't have the right fat content. Things an ordinary person wouldn't notice. But Paige did. She wrote them down, then decided to cook a sample plate using the exact ingredients she wanted, so she could compare the difference. She took supplies from the backup storage, replaced each item one by one, then began to cook. When she cooked, everything around her disappeared. The steady sound of the knife striking the cutting board, the sizzle of oil in the pan, the smell of garlic blooming through the kitchen. She didn't think about Genevieve. She didn't think about whose name would be on the menu. She only cooked. About 40 minutes later, a server stepped into the kitchen, looked around, then looked at Paige. "Mrs. Ashford wants to taste something before the event." She asked for a plate to be brought up. Paige looked at the dish she had just finished. It was the sample plate she had cooked to test the ingredients, not something meant to be served to anyone. But it was the best plate she could make at that moment. She nodded, wiped the rim of the plate clean, then handed it to the server to take away. 15 minutes passed, then 20 minutes. Paige went back to checking the ingredients, trying not to think about the plate of food somewhere on a higher floor of this building, sitting in front of a woman she had never met. Then the server came back. "Mrs. Ashford wants to meet the person who cooked this." Paige stopped moving. She looked down at what she was wearing. Black pants, a white shirt tucked neatly in, flat shoes, her hair tied high. Not elegant, but clean. She followed the server out of the kitchen, through the back corridor, into a private elevator, and stepped into a sitting room on the highest floor, a place she had never imagined she would set foot in. Catherine Ashford was seated in an armchair beside the window overlooking the whole city. She wore no jewelry, no heavy makeup, only a thin, cream-colored sweater. But the way she sat, the way she turned her head to look at Paige when she entered, gave off a kind of authority money couldn't buy. It was the calmness of someone who had seen enough of everything in life. On the small table in front of her, the plate of food was completely empty. Catherine looked Paige up and down, not in a judging way, but as if she were searching for something. Then she spoke, her voice gentle, but every word clear. "Sit down, child." Paige sat in the chair across from her, back straight, both hands resting on her thighs. Catherine looked at the empty plate on the table, then back at Paige. "My husband died 5 years ago. He was the only person in this family who knew how to cook. Since the day he left, I've eaten at the most expensive restaurants in the city, hired the finest private chefs to serve me, but I haven't felt what I just felt in a very long time." She paused, her eyes resting on the empty plate. "That dish just now wasn't only delicious. It reminded me what it feels like when someone cooks for you with their whole heart. I haven't had that feeling in so long." Paige didn't know what to say. She could only manage one sentence. "Thank you, ma'am." Catherine smiled, lightly but warmly. "You work for Genevieve Cross?" "Yes, ma'am." "How long?" 3 years. Catherine nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something she had already suspected. She didn't ask anything more about Genevieve. Instead, she leaned forward a little. "Next week we're holding a charity gala downstairs. I want you to come, as my personal guest." Paige blinked. "Ma'am, I'm only the person sent here to inspect the kitchen." "I know who you are," Catherine said, her voice still gentle, but leaving no room for refusal. "And I want you there." Paige was silent for a moment. She looked at the empty plate on the table, looked at the woman in front of her, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Catherine leaned back in her chair, her eyes still resting on Paige for a few more seconds, as if she had just found something she had been searching for a very long time. Then she smiled. "Good. Now go back to the kitchen. I believe you still have a great deal of work to do. Paige stood, bowed her head slightly, then stepped out of the room. On the way back to the kitchen, her steps felt lighter than when she had arrived, but her mind felt much heavier. She had just been invited into a place where she knew very well she didn't belong, and she didn't know that this invitation would pull everything that was about to happen along behind it. Paige returned to the kitchen after meeting Catherine, her mind still echoing with the gala invitation she hadn't yet had time to fully understand. But she didn't have time to think about it any further, because the moment she stepped through the kitchen door, the ingredient discrepancies she had discovered earlier were still staring her in the face. She knew she had to take matters into her own hands immediately. She took the list of notes she had written that morning and walked straight to the hotel's head chef, a broad-shouldered, middle-aged man who was standing beside the main counter, ordering his staff to lay out the tools. Paige handed him the list and said that several ingredients needed to be replaced before the gala night. The head chef glanced at the paper, then glanced at Paige, then set the paper down on the counter without bothering to read it all. I take orders from Genevieve Cross, not from an assistant cook. His voice wasn't loud, but the way he said the words, assistant cook, was enough to make 3 employees standing nearby look up. Paige didn't answer, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had heard sentences like this too many times in her life to know that arguing with words never defeated prejudice. She only said one short sentence. Let me borrow a corner of the kitchen for 15 minutes. The head chef shrugged, as if she could do whatever she wanted, then turned his back and went on. Paige walked into the backup storage room and personally chose every replacement ingredient. The olive oil with the right label, the right kind of sea salt, the butter with the exact fat ratio she needed. She carried everything back to the counter, turned on the stove, and began to cook. 15 minutes later, she placed 2 plates side by side on the steel counter. On the left was the plate cooked with the hotel's old ingredients. On the right was the plate cooked with the ingredients she had chosen. The same dish, the same recipe, but anyone with a normal sense of smell could tell the difference from half a meter away. Paige looked at the head chef. Taste them, then decide. The head chef looked at the 2 plates, then looked at Paige, then crossed his arms over his chest. I don't need to taste them. The hotel's ingredients have already been approved. I follow procedure, not the personal opinion of an outsider. He turned his back again and walked toward the group of staff standing near the refrigerator. Paige stood there, both hands resting on the counter, looking at the 2 plates of food. She wasn't angry. She was only tired of having to prove things that the food itself should have been able to prove. She didn't know that she wasn't the only person in that kitchen looking at those 2 plates. The rear kitchen door, the passage reserved for hotel management, had been standing slightly open for some time. Beckett Ashford stood there, his back resting lightly against the doorframe, both hands in his trouser pockets, silent. He had been there since before Paige placed the 2 plates on the counter. He saw her cook. He saw her refuse to argue. He saw her let the food speak for her, and he saw the head chef turn his back and walk away without even tasting it. Beckett stepped into the kitchen, without saying a word. His footsteps weren't heavy, but there was something about them that changed the air immediately. The employee nearest the door recognized him first, then straightened up, then the next person, then the next, like a silent wave spreading from the doorway into the middle of the kitchen. The head chef turned back when he heard the unusual silence, and his face changed at once when he saw who was standing in front of the counter. Beckett didn't look at the head chef. He looked at the 2 plates. Then he picked up a spoon and tasted the plate on the left, set the spoon down, picked up another spoon and tasted the plate on the right, set the spoon down. Everything happened slowly, precisely, as if he were reading a contract, not tasting food. When he was done, he pointed to the plate on the right, Paige's plate. Use this one. Replace every ingredient according to her list. The head chef stepped forward, opening his mouth as if he meant to say something about procedure, about approval, about ingredients that had already been ordered. Beckett turned his head and looked at him. Only looked. He didn't say another word, but that look carried more weight than any threat. The head chef stopped halfway, his mouth still open, but no sound came out. Beckett spoke, his voice soft, almost a whisper. But in that utterly silent kitchen, everyone heard every word clearly. If I hear one more disrespectful word toward the person who cooked this plate, I won't close the kitchen. I'll replace the head chef. The head chef swallowed. His hands dropped to his sides, trembling slightly. He nodded once, said nothing, then stepped back. Beckett turned to Paige for the first time. The two of them looked at each other. Paige said nothing. Beckett said nothing either. He only gave a small nod, so slight it was almost impossible to notice without looking carefully. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen through the rear door, the same way he had entered. His footsteps faded, then disappeared. The kitchen slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The staff began to move. The head chef went back to work without looking at Paige again, and Paige stood there a little longer, staring at the rear door where Beckett had just vanished. She didn't know his name. She didn't know who he was. She only knew that he had just tasted her food, and he had chosen her plate without asking a single question. News of Catherine's invitation reached Margot Ashford before Paige even had time to leave the hotel. One of the servers from the upper floor mentioned it to the manager. The manager mentioned it to Margot's assistant, and less than 2 hours later, Margot was standing outside the door of Beckett's private office on the 12th floor of the Ashford Grand Hotel. She knocked twice, then walked in without waiting for an answer, because that was how she had done it since they were children. Beckett sat behind his desk, reading a folder, not looking up when she entered. Margot sat down in the chair across from him, crossed her legs, and began speaking in a soft voice, the kind of voice she used when she wanted the listener to think she was being concerned, rather than calculating. "Do you know who the girl Aunt Catherine just invited to the gala is? She's a contract employee of Genevieve Cross. No formal degree. From the South Side. If the press photographs her sitting at the same table as our family, what do you think they'll write?" Beckett turned another page in the file, still not looking up. "Who my mother invites is my mother's business." Margot paused for a beat, then changed direction. Her voice softened a little, carrying the smile she had practiced for years. "Whitney is really looking forward to going with you that night. She's had her dress ready since last week." This time, Beckett looked up. He looked at Margot, and there was no warmth in his eyes. "Margot, this is the last time I'm saying this. That was all. No explanation, nothing more." Margot understood, because she knew her cousin well enough to know that when Beckett said the last time, it truly was the last time. She stood, smoothed her dress, and smiled as if the conversation just now had been nothing more than casual talk between cousins. Then she walked out, closing the door gently behind her, but in the hallway, the smile disappeared. Her hand tightened around the strap of her handbag until her knuckles went pale. 20 minutes later, Margot was sitting across from Whitney Vale in a cafe in the wealthy eastern part of the city. Whitney held her coffee cup with both hands, her nails perfectly polished, her blonde hair arranged so neatly that not a single strand was out of place. She was beautiful in the way every upper-class party needed someone to be beautiful, and she knew it. Margot told her everything, about Paige, about Catherine's invitation, and about the way Beckett had looked at Paige in the kitchen that afternoon when he tasted her plate of food, then ordered every ingredient replaced without asking a single question. Whitney set her coffee cup down, slowly, with control. Her face didn't change much, but her eyes turned visibly cold. How did he look at her? As if she were the only thing in that kitchen worth looking at. Margot said. Whitney was silent for a moment. Then she said, her voice flat, "Beckett is mine. He just doesn't know it yet." Margot leaned forward and lowered her voice. "I have a way, but I need you to agree first." Whitney looked at her, neither nodding nor shaking her head. She only looked, the kind of look that gave Margot permission to continue. Margot took out her phone and made a call. On the other end was Genevieve Cross. Margot spoke in a polite, friendly voice, the voice she used when she wanted someone to do what she wanted, while thinking it had been their own idea. "Genevieve, I'm calling to let you know in advance about the gala night. This year, my family has added a special segment, introducing the head chef on stage. My aunt is very much looking forward to it." Genevieve listened, and Margot could almost see the smile on the other end of the line. A chance to stand on stage in front of high society was something Genevieve would never refuse. "There's just one small thing," Margot continued, her tone as if she had only just remembered it. "Your employee, Paige. My aunt invited her to the gala. Please help me tell her that this year we're doing it in a relaxed, intimate style. There's no need to be too formal. Don't let her feel pressured to overdress. We don't want anyone to feel awkward." Margot stopped at exactly the right moment, letting the last sentence hang in the air, just enough for Genevieve to fill in the blank herself. And Genevieve filled it in at once. An assistant cook dressed simply in the middle of an upper-class ballroom wouldn't draw attention. She wouldn't stand out more than her boss. She would stay exactly where Genevieve wanted her to stay. behind her, in the shadows, where no one would see her. "I understand," Genevieve said. "I'll tell her." The call ended. Margot set the phone down on the table and looked at Whitney. Neither of them needed to say anything more. That evening, Paige was sitting in her small apartment, her recipe notebook open in front of her, when her phone rang. "Genevieve." "Paige, about the gala night. There's no need to dress up too much. Keep it simple. The attention should be on the food, not the clothes. You understand what I mean, don't you?" Paige understood, or at least she thought she did. "Yes. Good." Genevieve hung up. Paige set the phone down and looked into her small closet. Jeans, a white shirt, canvas shoes. Those were the best things she had. And her boss had just told her that simple was enough. She had no reason to doubt it. Because for the past 3 years, Genevieve had been the only person who gave her a job when no one else would even bother looking at the resume of a girl from the South Side with no degree. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and went to sleep, not knowing that her boss had just become the final link in a trap someone else had already laid, and that she was the only person in this story who didn't know she was walking into it. The gala night arrived. Paige entered the Ashford Grand Hotel through the rear side door, the same entrance she had used the first time she came to inspect the kitchen. But instead of turning left into the kitchen as she always did, she turned right, following the receptionist's directions, heading toward the grand ballroom where the guests were gathering. She had taken exactly 3 steps into the ballroom when she stopped. Everything struck her eyes all at once, and she understood immediately. She had been tricked. She turned around, quickly, before anyone else had time to look at her, before the whispers could spread any wider, walking quickly down the hallway, pushed open the kitchen door, and stepped into the only place in this building where she felt she had the right to exist. The industrial kitchen was still brightly lit, the staff rushing through preparations for service. Paige went straight to the main counter where the plates had already been arranged, waiting to be carried out. She looked at the first plate and stopped. This wasn't her dish. She walked along the counter, plate by plate, her eyes sweeping over every dish, every arrangement, every sauce. The 2 main courses she had spent the entire week creating had disappeared completely. In their place were familiar plates, bland, forgettable plates, the kind her boss would serve when Paige wasn't behind the stove. They didn't just want her out of the ballroom. They wanted to erase her from the kitchen. The door swung open. A server looked her up and down and asked, "Are you the new dishwasher?" Before Paige could answer, the door opened again. And the man who walked in was not staff. Beckett Ashford. He didn't look at her clothes, didn't look at her shoes. He looked straight at her and said one thing. "This dinner is yours. You should be out there." Paige choked back a bitter laugh, gesturing to the counter. "They changed the menu, Mr. Ashford. This isn't my dinner anymore." Beckett stared at the bland plates, his expression hardening. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply looked into her eyes and asked a question that changed everything. "Can you cook it again in 2 hours?" Paige looked at him, then down at her hands. The hands that had cooked nearly 100 recipes in that old notebook. She tied her hair again, washed her hands, and began. She didn't ask anyone's permission. She took ingredients from storage and began cooking the 2 main courses Genevieve had erased. There was only food, only her hands, and 2 hours that someone had just given her as a chance to prove herself. 2 hours later, the servers began carrying plates out into the grand ballroom. The guests, who had been talking warmly and loudly, began to slow down when the first plate was set on the table. Then the second, then the third. No one said it out loud, but the way their hands stopped halfway, the way they looked at the food in front of them and then at the plate beside them, showed that they had all recognized the same thing. This wasn't Genevieve Cross's style. Genevieve's food was always beautiful, always proper, always so safe that it could be predicted from the first bite to the last. But what lay on the tables tonight was different. The presentation didn't follow any pattern that fine dining restaurants usually used. The sauce wasn't the familiar kind. The fragrance rising from each plate carried something no one in the room could name, but everyone could feel. A plain, honest truth that money couldn't buy and reputation couldn't imitate. The guests began to eat, and the room gradually fell quiet in a natural way, not because anyone demanded silence, but because when food becomes good enough, people forget to talk. Genevieve sat at the main table beside several very important guests, her face holding a perfect smile, but her eyes swept over every plate on the table, and she knew these weren't the plates she had substituted before the gala. Someone had changed them back. and she knew who. But she couldn't say anything, couldn't stand up and question it in the middle of the banquet hall, couldn't do anything except sit there and keep smiling, while the thing she had tried to hide was being served in front of more than 100 people. At the far end of the ballroom, Catherine Ashford ate slowly. She tasted each bite, paused, then tasted another, as if she were reading a letter written in flavor instead of words. When the final plate at her table was completely clean, Catherine set down her knife and fork, touched her napkin to the corner of her mouth, then slowly stood. The whole room paid attention, because when Catherine Ashford stood in the middle of a party, it always meant something. She looked across the ballroom, then spoke, her voice not loud. But in the sudden silence of the room, every word carried clearly to the farthest corner. "I want to thank the person who cooked tonight's dinner. Please step forward." Genevieve reacted at once. She set her napkin down, put on the radiant smile she had practiced for hundreds of television interviews, and began to rise from her chair. Catherine lifted one hand, gentle but firm. "I'm not talking about you, Genevieve." Genevieve froze halfway, neither fully standing nor sitting. The smile was still on her face, but it had hardened like plaster. The whole room went so quiet that the sound of the candles burning on the tables could almost be heard. Catherine turned her head and looked toward the kitchen door. Paige. A beat passed. Then the kitchen door opened. Paige stepped out, still in her jeans, still in her white shirt, but now her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, a streak of flour still on her wrist because she hadn't had time to wash it away, a few strands of hair slipping loose from her tied-up hair and sticking with sweat against her temple. She stood there, on the threshold between the kitchen and the grand ballroom, between her world and the world that wasn't hers, looking completely unlike anyone else in that room, and that was exactly why every eye fixed on her. Catherine looked at Paige, and her eyes softened in the way only people who have lived long enough know how to soften. "My husband died 5 years ago," she said, her voice slower than before, every word carrying a little more weight that she didn't try to hide. "He wasn't a professional chef. He was only a man who loved cooking for his family on the weekends. But every dish he made had something I haven't found in any restaurant over the past 5 years. She paused, her eyes never leaving Paige. Until tonight. The ballroom remained silent. Not an awkward silence, but the silence of more than 100 people all feeling something real at the same time. Catherine turned to Genevieve, and her voice changed, still gentle, but carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. "I also know who changed tonight's menu to hide the talent of the person standing in front of me." Genevieve didn't move. The smile on her face had disappeared at some point, replaced by a stiffness no layer of makeup could cover. Then Catherine turned toward the right side of the ballroom, where Margot was standing beside Whitney Vale. She didn't say Margot's name. She only looked, and that look was heavy enough to make Margot turn her face away. Whitney stood beside her, her face going one shade paler. She had been the one whispering the loudest when Paige first entered the ballroom at the beginning of the night. The one who had leaned toward her friends and sneered that someone hadn't read the invitation, and now she stood still as a statue, her eyes lowered to the floor, not daring to look at Catherine, not daring to look at anyone. Catherine turned back to Paige one last time, her voice softer now, warmer now. "You should be proud of what your hands created tonight." Paige stood there without saying anything, not because she didn't want to speak, but because her throat had closed up. She only nodded once, then stepped back toward the kitchen door, returning to the place where she belonged. The party continued after that. Conversation returned, but more quietly now, as if everyone was reconsidering something in their own mind. The jazz music still played, champagne was still poured, but the air had changed, and no one could pretend that everything was the same as before. Near the end of the evening, when the guests began to leave, Catherine was still sitting in her familiar armchair, but Beckett noticed that his mother didn't stand to see the guests off the way she did every year. She sat there, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, her eyes half closed. He walked over, bent down, and saw her hand trembling, not trembling from the cold, trembling in the rhythm he had seen a few times over the past year, the rhythm the doctor had warned would appear more and more often. "Mother." Beckett spoke softly, placing his hand over hers. Catherine opened her eyes and smiled at him, the kind of smile mothers give when they don't want their children to worry. "I'm all right, just a little tired." But when Beckett helped her stand, he felt the weight she leaned onto his arm more than usual. He guided her across the ballroom, slowly, with short steps, and said nothing more. but his hand held his mother's tighter than ever, as if he held on tightly enough, he could keep her with him a little longer. 3 days after the gala night, Catherine Ashford was admitted to the hospital. Her heart could not take it. The doctor said that prolonged emotional strain, combined with a heart that had already been weak, had caused her to decline faster than expected. Beckett received the call from the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning, drove there in 10 minutes, and from that moment on, he did not leave the 12th floor of the downtown hospital. He sat in the chair beside his mother's bed, still wearing the same suit from the meeting the night before, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, his eyes never leaving her even while she slept. Neil stood outside in the hallway, blocking every call, every appointment, everything. When Beckett said he was staying at the hospital, no one asked for how long, because no one dared to. The next morning, Margot came, Whitney came, several people from the family came. Everyone brought flowers, gifts, and polite words of concern. Catherine looked at them, nodded, thanked them, then closed her eyes again, as if every conversation drained away another small part of the little strength she still had left. By afternoon, when the hospital room was finally quiet, Catherine opened her eyes, turned her head toward Beckett, and asked only one question. "Where's Paige?" Beckett looked at his mother. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask why his mother had not mentioned anyone else among all the people who had just visited, but was asking for a girl she had met exactly twice. He simply took out his phone and called. Paige answered after 3 rings. Beckett spoke briefly, his voice lower than usual, carrying something Paige had never heard in him before. "My mother is at the downtown hospital. She wants to see you." Paige did not ask what had happened. She did not ask what was wrong with her. She only said, "I'll come," and hung up. 40 minutes later, Paige stepped into the hallway on the 12th floor. She did not bring flowers. She did not bring a gift. She brought nothing except a small, insulated container held in her right hand. She wore a thin jacket over a t-shirt, simple cloth pants, and old flat shoes. She looked nothing like anyone who had visited Catherine that day, and perhaps that was exactly why, when she walked into the hospital room, Catherine opened her eyes and smiled for the first time that day. "You came." Paige sat down in the chair beside the bed and placed the insulated container on the table. She opened the lid, and the smell of hot porridge spread through the hospital room. The light scent of ginger, the fragrance of fried shallots, the deep smell of slowly simmered bone broth, a smell that did not belong to a hospital, but to some kitchen far warmer than this one. "I cooked you a little porridge," Paige said softly. "It isn't anything special, just porridge." She scooped up a small spoonful, blew on it until it cooled, then gave it to Catherine. Catherine took the spoon, her hand trembling slightly, but she still lifted it to her mouth by herself. She tasted it, then she stopped. Her eyes moved to the spoonful of porridge, then up to Paige, then down to the spoon again. She did not speak for a long while, not because the porridge wasn't good, but because it was good in a way she had not prepared herself to receive. Catherine's eyes slowly reddened. She set the spoon down, then reached out and took Paige's hand. Her hand was thin and light, the skin so fragile that the blue veins beneath it could be seen. But the way she held on was firm, as if she were holding something important. "It's been so long," she said, her voice quiet, trembling slightly at the end of the sentence, "since anyone cooked for me with this kind of love." Paige held her hand back. She looked at Catherine, looked into the reddened eyes of a woman she had only met a few times, yet somehow felt as if she had known for a very long time. Then she said, so softly it was almost a whisper, "My mother used to make this for me too. You're the second person who has eaten it." Catherine looked at her, and in that moment, inside a stark white hospital room heavy with the smell of antiseptic, the 2 women did not need to say anything more. One had lost her mother long ago, one was growing weaker, and between them was a bowl of porridge, made from the recipe of someone who was gone. The only thing Paige had brought, not out of politeness or duty, but because it was the most precious thing she had. Beckett stood in the doorway of the hospital room. He had been standing there since Paige walked in, his back resting lightly against the doorframe, both arms folded across his chest. He did not step inside. He did not say anything. He only stood there and watched Paige hold his mother's hand, watched his mother smile for the first time since being admitted to the hospital. He watched the steaming bowl of porridge on the bedside table, among the expensive bouquets no one had bothered to smell, and for the first time, his eyes turned red, not red from crying. Beckett Ashford did not cry, not in front of anyone, perhaps not even when he was alone, but his eyes reddened in the way that only happens when someone has held something inside for too long. He turned his face away, looked out into the hallway, took a slow breath, then turned back again. Paige stayed for another half-hour. She gave Catherine a few more spoonfuls of porridge, speaking softly about things that did not matter, about how nice the weather was today, about how next time she would add a little white pepper. Then she stood, held Catherine's hand one last time, and said she would come back. Catherine nodded, her eyes already heavy with exhaustion. Paige stepped out of the room and passed Beckett at the door. The two of them looked at each other for a brief moment. Paige gave a small nod, then walked down the hallway and disappeared around the corner. Beckett watched her until her shadow was gone, then turned and stepped back into the hospital room. Catherine had opened her eyes and was waiting for him. "Close the door, son." Beckett closed the door and pulled the chair beside the bed closer before sitting down. Catherine looked at him, her eyes tired but completely clear, the kind of clarity that belongs to someone who knows exactly what she wants to say and knows she may not have many chances left to say it. "All my life, I've lived among wealthy, powerful people," she said slowly. "I've never met anyone who gave me something without expecting something in return. Until her." Beckett said nothing. She went on. "You're like your father, hard on the outside, soft on the inside. Your father was the same, so hard that he pushed people away without knowing it." She reached out and touched his hand. "Don't let that hardness push her away, Beckett." Beckett held his mother's hand, gently but firmly. "You're going to be all right." Catherine smiled, a thin, tired smile, but a real one. "I know I won't be all right forever, but I want to know that you'll be all right." Beckett did not answer. He only held his mother's hand tighter, sitting there in the silent hospital room while, beyond the window, the city began to light up, and for the first time in a very long while, he did not know what to say, because nothing he could say would change what his mother had just told him. The next morning, Paige arrived at Lumiere earlier than usual. She did not go into the kitchen. She sat at the small table in the staff room at the back, placed her handbag on the table, and waited. She knew Genevieve would come. After what had happened on gala night, after Catherine Ashford's words in front of more than 100 guests, Genevieve could not stay away. And just as Paige had expected, at 9:15, the familiar sound of heels clicked against the tile floor of the hallway. Genevieve stepped into the staff room, closed the door behind her, then sat down in the chair across from Paige. She wore a black blazer, her hair perfectly brushed, her makeup carefully done even though it was only 9 o'clock in the morning. But beneath that familiar shell, Paige recognized something she had never seen in Genevieve before. Unease. Not obvious, not exposed, but it was there in the way Genevieve placed her hands on the table, a little too carefully, a little too controlled, as if she were trying to keep her balance on a surface she knew was tilting. Genevieve spoke first, her voice calm, professional, the voice she used when she wanted to turn everything into a negotiation. "That night shouldn't have happened that way. I admit a few things went too far." She paused, as if waiting for Paige to react. Paige did not react. She sat still, both hands on the table, looking at Genevieve and waiting. Genevieve continued. "I've thought about it a great deal, and I want to propose a change. It won't be an employer and employee relationship anymore. I want us to become partners. A partnership. Your name will appear on the menu, on the website, on everything." She leaned forward, lowering her voice, as if she were sharing a secret. "Lumiere by Genevieve Cross and Paige Mercer. My name will come first because the brand already exists, but your name will be there. This is what you deserve to receive." Paige listened to every word. She heard the way Genevieve said, "deserve to receive," as if it were a gift Genevieve was bestowing, not something Paige had created with her own hands over the past 3 years. She heard the way Genevieve's name would still come first, always first, because that was the only thing Genevieve truly cared about. Paige heard all of it. Then silence stretched for a few seconds in the cramped little staff room, long enough for Genevieve to begin leaning back slightly, because she wasn't used to someone not reacting immediately to her offer. Paige bent down, opened her handbag, and took out a thick stack of papers. She placed it on the table between them, with both hands, gently but firmly, like someone laying down the final card. The stack was about 2 centimeters thick, every page a photocopy from the recipe notebook Paige had written by hand over the past 3 years. 100 pages, one recipe on each page. Each page had a clear date written in the upper right corner. Each page was a dish Genevieve had stood in front of cameras and claimed as her own. Genevieve looked at the stack of papers, then at Paige, then back at the stack of papers, and for the first time, the unease on her face could no longer be hidden. Paige spoke, her voice neither loud nor soft, flat in the way she had learned from the man seated at the head of the table in the basement of the Ashford Hotel, even though she did not know she had learned it. These are 100 recipes I created during the 3 years I worked for you. Each page has a date. Every dish you claimed as yours on television, in the press, and everywhere else, I wrote down. Genevieve opened her mouth, but Paige had not stopped. I don't need you to admit it in front of anyone. I only need you to know, and I need myself to know, that I don't owe you anything. She placed one more sheet of paper on top of the stack of recipes. A resignation letter, dated that morning. This is my last month at Lumiere. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Then Genevieve changed. The polite shell, the professional negotiating voice, all of it disappeared in a single breath. Her eyes narrowed, her shoulders straightened, and her voice turned cold in a way Paige had never heard in the past 3 years but had always known existed somewhere beneath the mask. Who do you think you are? Genevieve said, slowly, each word clear as if she were carving it into the air. I gave you a job when no one else would even look at your resume. I let you stand in a 2-star Michelin kitchen when you don't have a single diploma hanging on your wall. And now you put a stack of paper on the table and think you can walk away? She leaned forward. I'll make sure not one restaurant in this city, in this state, in this entire country, hires you. You walk out that door, you walk into nothing. Paige looked at Genevieve, looked straight at her, without blinking, without retreating. 3 years ago, that threat would have made her lower her head. It would have sent her back into the kitchen. It would have made her keep cooking dishes that carried someone else's name because she had no other choice. But tonight, she had just cooked a bowl of porridge for Catherine Ashford, from the recipe her mother had left behind, and Catherine had cried. And Paige understood that the value of her hands did not live in anyone's kitchen, did not live in anyone's brand, did not live in anyone's permission. You can take my name off everything I've ever cooked, Paige said, her voice still flat, still unshaken. But you can't take these hands away. Then she stood. She did not wait for a reaction. She did not look back. She pushed the chair in, picked up her handbag, and walked out the staff room door. The door closed gently behind her, not slammed, not dramatic, just an ordinary door closing in an ordinary way. But both of them knew that what had just closed was not the door. Genevieve sat alone in the staff room, staring at the 100 pages of recipes on the table, staring at the resignation letter lying on top, and for the first time in a very long while, she did not know what the next step was. But that did not last, because Genevieve Cross was not the kind of woman who sat still when someone walked out of her door without asking permission. Genevieve did not waste much time. That very afternoon, after Paige placed her resignation letter on the table, Genevieve was already sitting in her lawyer's office in the city's financial district, with a 3-person team that specialized in handling commercial disputes for the fine dining world. The lawsuit was drafted in less than 2 days. Its claim was that Paige Mercer had violated her employment contract and stolen trade secrets belonging to the intellectual property of Genevieve Cross and Lumiere Restaurant. Genevieve declared that every recipe Paige had used at the Ashford Gala was Lumiere's property, developed during the time Paige worked under her, using her ingredients and her equipment, and therefore belonged entirely to Genevieve under the signed employment contract. And that contract was exactly the thing Genevieve did not have to search far to find. Margot Ashford sent her a copy only 1 day after the gala night. No one knew where Margot had gotten it, but Paige could guess, because among all the people who wanted her to disappear from the Ashford family's world, Margot was the most patient and the most calculating. Clause 12 in the contract stated clearly, in the kind of legal language Paige had not read carefully when she signed it 3 years earlier, at a time when she had been desperate for a job, that every culinary creation developed during the contract period belonged to Genevieve Cross and the Lumiere brand. Every creation. No exceptions. The lawsuit was filed in court. The culinary press reported it within the week. But Genevieve did not stop there. She picked up the phone and began calling. One person after another. Restaurant owners she knew. Head chefs she had worked with. Critics she had once invited to dine for free. Food magazine editors she had given exclusive interviews to. With each person, she told the same story. Paige Mercer was a former assistant cook with no degree. Someone who had stolen Lumiere's recipes and then walked away, and anyone who hired her would face a similar lawsuit. Every door slammed shut in Paige's face. The first restaurant she applied to called back after 2 days and said the position had already been filled. The second restaurant never called back. The third called back only to say they weren't in the right position to hire at this time. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth. No one even bothered answering her email. By the end of the second week, Paige was sitting in her small South Side apartment, looking at her mother's recipe notebook on the table. And for the first time, she wondered whether walking out of Lumiere had been a mistake. She did not have next month's rent yet. She was saving every dollar for food, and now her name was tied to the word theft in every conversation in the city's culinary world. She placed her hand on the notebook, touched its worn old spine, and sat there for a long time in the darkness of her small kitchen. But she did not call anyone. She did not call Beckett. She did not call Catherine. She did not call anyone to ask for help, because these hands were hers, and if she lost, she would lose with her own hands, not with someone else's pity. While Paige sat in the dark, on the other side of the city, another investigation was unfolding without her knowing. Right after the gala night, when Catherine was taken to the hospital, Beckett had given Neil Grady an order. Not an order related to his mother's health. A different order. Find out everything about Genevieve Cross. Finances, partners, funding sources, cash flow, all of it. Neil did not ask why. He only nodded and got to work. The Ashford family's financial team needed less than a week to find something that ordinary auditors would have taken months to uncover. The money flowing into Lumiere did not come only from restaurant revenue and commercial contracts. There was a large investment source, steady every quarter, coming from a shell company that, when traced backward, led to one name: Carver Briggs. Beckett knew Carver, not in the way of friends or partners. He knew him in the way people operating in the underworld knew one another. By reputation, by territory, by invisible boundaries everyone understood, but no one put on paper. Carver Briggs laundered money through a chain of fine dining restaurants. Everyone in the underworld knew that. But the fact that he was laundering money through Lumiere, through Genevieve Cross, through the restaurant Paige had just walked away from, that was new information. Beckett sat in his office on the 12th floor of the Ashford Grand Hotel, read the report Neil had placed in front of him, then folded it shut. He picked up the phone, called the person in charge of the family's finances, and gave one short order: block Carver Briggs's next money transfer through the banking system controlled by Ashford Holdings. No explanation. No need for anyone to ask again. The call ended in less than 1 minute. Beckett set the phone down and looked out the window. He knew that blocking Carver Briggs's money was no different from throwing a stone into a hornet's nest. He would react, and when he reacted, he would not go after Beckett, because he was not strong enough. He would go after the person he believed was the cause, the person he thought Beckett was protecting. Beckett knew that, and he still gave the order to block the money, because in his world, waiting meant giving the enemy more time, and he never gave anyone more time. The first hearing took place on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. Paige arrived at the county courthouse at 8:30, alone, wearing the only decent outfit she owned: a dark gray blazer she had bought on sale 2 years earlier, black cloth pants, and the cleanest pair of flat shoes in her closet. She carried a canvas bag, and inside it were the old recipe notebook with the worn spine and the stack of 100 photocopied pages she had placed in front of Genevieve the week before. She had no lawyer. No one came with her. She sat down at the table on the left side of the courtroom, set the canvas bag on her lap, and waited. At the table on the right, Genevieve's legal team sat 3 across. Black suits, leather briefcases, fountain pens lined neatly on the table. Genevieve wasn't there. She didn't need to be there when she already had 3 representatives whose hourly fees were higher than Paige's rent for an entire month. The hearing began. Genevieve's lead attorney stood first. He presented everything neatly, professionally, point by point. Paige Mercer had signed an employment contract with Lumiere 3 years earlier. Clause 12 clearly stated that every culinary creation made during the contract period belonged to Genevieve Cross. Paige had used those recipes at the Ashford Gala without written consent from the owner. That was breach of contract and theft of trade secrets. Clear, clean, nailed down. The judge looked toward Paige. "Miss Mercer, do you have legal counsel?" "No, Your Honor." "You're representing yourself?" "Yes." The judge wrote something in the file, then nodded. "You may present your position." Genevieve's attorney began pressing her with questions, his voice polite, but every question designed to drive Paige into a corner. Miss Mercer, do you have a degree from any culinary institute? No. Do you have any professional certification in the culinary field? No. Did you complete any formal training before working at Lumiere? No. The attorney stopped, letting those 3 no's hang in the courtroom long enough for everyone to feel their weight. Then he continued, his voice still polite, but the implication was clear. Then on what basis do you claim that the recipes you used at the gala were your personal creations, rather than products developed within the environment and conditions provided by Lumiere? Paige looked at the attorney. Then she looked down at the canvas bag on her lap. She opened the bag, took out the old notebook with the worn brown leather cover, and placed it on the table in front of her. She did not speak right away. She only set the notebook down gently, then opened it, turning the first page toward the judge. Then she took the stack of 100 photocopied pages and placed it beside the notebook. These are 100 recipes I wrote by hand during the 3 years I worked at Lumiere, Paige said, her voice not trembling, not raised, flat but clear in every word. Every page has a date. Every recipe is mine. I wrote them before I came to Lumiere, while I was at Lumiere, and I'll keep writing them after I leave Lumiere. Genevieve Cross can't submit anything similar to this court, because she isn't the person who wrote them. The attorney looked at the stack of papers, then at the old notebook, then back at Paige. He changed direction, his voice a little sharper than before. You said you have no degree, no formal training. Then where did you learn to cook? Paige looked down at the open notebook in front of her. The first 17 pages were written in faded blue ink, in the slightly slanted handwriting she knew by heart, every stroke of it. She placed her hand lightly on the first page, then looked up. From the person who wrote the first pages in this notebook. She said nothing more. She did not explain who had written them. She did not tell the story. She didn't need to. The courtroom fell silent. The judge looked at the notebook, at the old handwriting on the first page, then looked at Paige. Genevieve's attorney stayed silent for a beat longer than usual before returning to his table. The first hearing ended without a ruling. The judge ordered both sides to submit additional evidence within 10 days. Paige walked out of the courthouse, went down the front steps, and sat on the bottom step. She placed the notebook on her lap, both hands resting on the old leather cover, and breathed out. She had not won. She knew that. Her 3 no's were still in the record. The contract with Clause 12 was still a valid legal document, and Genevieve's legal team would return with more ammunition. But at least today, she had stood there, alone, and the entire courtroom had listened. 10 days later. The second hearing, Paige arrived at court at 8:15, 15 minutes earlier than last time. Still alone, still in the gray blazer, still with the notebook in the canvas bag. She sat down at the table on the left, placed the bag on her lap, and prepared herself for a long morning. But before the judge entered the courtroom door opened, and a man walked in. Tall, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, carrying a black leather briefcase. Paige had never seen him before. He walked straight to the table on the left, where Paige was sitting, pulled out the chair, sat down beside her, opened the briefcase, and began laying documents neatly on the table. Then he turned to Paige and spoke in a low, professional voice, without a trace of unnecessary emotion. I'm Warren Holt. I represent Miss Paige Mercer as of today. Paige looked at him, then at the files on the table, then back at him. Who hired you? Warren Holt did not turn to look at her. He was arranging the papers, one file at a time, with the precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. My client wishes to remain anonymous. Paige understood immediately. She did not need to ask anything else. There was only one person in this city who could hire an attorney to walk into a courtroom within 10 days without explaining why, and only one person who would never step forward to take credit for it. She looked at Warren Holt for another moment, a complicated feeling rising in her chest, part gratitude, part anger because someone had stepped into her fight again without asking her first. But she also knew that across the table were 3 lawyers with decades of experience, and all she had was an old notebook. She looked at Warren Holt one last time, then nodded once. Fine. You can stay. Warren Holt showed no further reaction. He only gave a slight nod, then continued arranging the files, calm and precise, as if this hearing were only one among many hearings he always won. And at the table on the right, Genevieve's 3 attorneys looked at Warren Holt, and for the first time, one of them picked up a pen and wrote something in his notebook with a hand that moved a little faster than usual. That evening, after the second hearing, Paige drove back to her Southside apartment in the kind of exhaustion she had grown used to. Tired from the hearing, tired from sitting beside a lawyer she hadn't hired and couldn't control, tired from knowing this fight wasn't over. She parked at the curb as usual, took the canvas bag from the passenger seat, and walked up the 3 steps leading to her apartment door. Then she stopped. The door was ajar. Not by much, only about 2 centimeters. Just enough for her to see the darkness inside through the narrow gap. Paige stood in front of the door, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag, staring at that open slit. She had lived here alone for 3 years. She always locked the door, always checked it twice before leaving. That morning, she remembered clearly that she had locked it, remembered the sound of the lock clicking into place, remembered tugging the handle once to make sure, the way she did every day. She pushed the door open slowly with her fingertips. The apartment inside was dark, the streetlight outside slipping through the window just enough for her to see the small living room. Everything was intact. The old sofa was still in its place. The small bookshelf still stood against the wall. The wardrobe was still closed. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had been taken. But something had been left behind. On the small wooden table in the middle of the room, the table where she wrote her recipes every night, there was a photograph. Paige stepped closer, and her heart beat harder with every step. It was a photograph of her, in the kitchen of the Ashford Grand Hotel. She was standing in front of the steel counter, a knife in her hand, her head slightly lowered, focused on the plate of food in front of her. The angle had been taken from the back of the kitchen, near the management door, where Beckett had stood that day. But this wasn't a picture Beckett had taken. This was a hidden photograph, taken by someone standing in a place she had never seen, at a moment when she had never suspected anything. Beside the photograph was a piece of white paper. Nothing was written on it, completely blank, and it was that emptiness that was the most frightening thing of all. Because it said, "I don't need to write anything. I got into your home. I know where you live. I know what you do, and I want you to know that." Paige put one hand on the table to steady herself, because her knees had begun to shake. Not the kind of shaking that came from cold or exhaustion, the kind that came when a person realized she was no longer safe inside her own home. She looked around the apartment, at the windows, at the door she had just pushed open, at every corner of the room as if she were seeing the place for the first time, and everything looked different. The walls no longer felt like walls that protected her. The door no longer felt like a door that kept the outside world out. Someone had crossed that boundary, quietly, leaving no trace except a photograph and a blank sheet of paper. And that was enough to make every bit of safety Paige had ever felt in this room disappear. She backed away from the table, her back touching the wall, then did something she had never done through everything that had happened. She took out her phone and called Beckett, not because she wanted someone to save her, but because, for the first time, she was afraid, truly afraid. Afraid in a way even the most skilled hands couldn't help with, in a way the recipe notebook on the shelf couldn't shield her from, afraid in the way a person is afraid alone in the dark, with proof that someone had stood inside this room while she wasn't home. Beckett answered after half a ring. Paige spoke, trying to keep her voice calm, but she heard herself trembling at the end of every sentence. "Someone got into my apartment. They didn't break anything. They only left a photograph of me in your hotel kitchen." Silence on the other end of the line. Not long, perhaps 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, Paige felt something change in Beckett's voice before he spoke, even though he hadn't said anything yet. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. I'm coming now." 15 minutes. Paige counted every minute, sitting on the floor beside the locked front door, her back against the wall, both arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't cry. She only sat there and waited, and every small sound in the apartment, the pipes, the wind outside the window, the refrigerator running, made her flinch. A knock came at the door. 2 knocks, firm and even. "Paige, it's me." She opened the door. Beckett stood there in a black suit, no tie, his eyes sharp. Behind him, Neil Grady stood 2 steps away, his hands in the pockets of his coat. Beckett stepped inside, looked around the apartment, then walked straight to the table. He looked at the photograph, looked at the blank sheet of paper. His face did not change. Not one muscle in his face moved, but his right hand closed, slowly, firmly, his knuckles growing pale, and Paige saw it because she was looking at his hand, not his face. He took out his phone, turned his back to Paige, and made a call. The voice he used on the phone was entirely different from the voice he used with her. Cold, flat, every word like an order that left no room for questions. Find out who did this. Handle it. He hung up, slipped the phone into his pocket, then turned to Paige, looked at her. Truly looked, in a way he didn't use in boardrooms or restaurants or anywhere else in his world. A way Paige had never seen from him before. "It isn't safe here," he said, his voice lighter now, but still leaving no room for refusal. "Come with me." Paige looked at him, then at the small apartment where she had lived for 3 years, her mother's photograph on the kitchen wall, the recipe notebook on the shelf, the wooden table where she had written nearly 100 pages. This was her home. But tonight, her home was no longer home. "Who are you really?" she asked, her voice soft now, but no longer trembling. Beckett looked at her, and for the first time, he did not answer with silence or with a nod. He answered directly, "The man who'll make sure no one can touch you." It was not an answer to the question she had asked, but it was the answer to the question she truly needed to hear. Paige took the recipe notebook from the shelf, placed it in the canvas bag, put on her coat, and walked out the door. She brought nothing else. Beckett stepped out behind her, Neil following last. The three of them went down the stairs in silence. A black car was already parked at the curb, its headlights off. Paige got into the back seat. Beckett sat beside her, and Neil sat in the front beside the driver. The car rolled through the night, heading toward the Ashford Grand Hotel. Paige looked through the window, watching her small South Side apartment shrink in the rearview mirror. She didn't know when she would come back. She didn't know whether she would come back at all. She only knew that in the canvas bag on her lap was her mother's notebook, and beside her was a man she still did not fully understand. But tonight, he was the only person she trusted enough to follow. The penthouse on the highest floor of the Ashford Grand Hotel was silent. Paige lay on the sofa, covered by the thin blanket someone had left there before she arrived, her mother's recipe notebook resting on the coffee table beside her, her canvas bag folded neatly at the foot of the sofa. She was so exhausted that the moment she closed her eyes, she fell asleep. No dreams, no restless turning, only the kind of sleep that comes to someone completely emptied out. Beckett stood in the living room doorway, watching her sleep for a few seconds. Then he took his coat from the rack beside the entrance, slipped it over his shoulders, and walked out. Neil Grady was already waiting in the hallway, his back against the wall, his hands in his pockets. He didn't ask where they were going. He had known from the moment Beckett looked at the photograph on the table in Paige's apartment. When Beckett drove out of the Ashford Hotel basement garage, Neil did not ride with him. Beckett went alone. That wasn't normal, and Neil knew it. But when Beckett said, "I'm going alone," there was no second sentence. The car moved through the city at night, past the financial district where the lights had gone dark, past the old Eastern Harbor where expensive seafood restaurants lined the docks, serving the upper class by day and hosting other kinds of meetings by night. The wharf sat at the end of the row, its front made of dark wood, its sign turned off, its main door closed. But light still glowed inside, faint through the gaps in the curtains. Beckett parked in front, cut the engine, and sat in the car for a few more seconds. Then he got out, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked straight to the front door. The door wasn't locked, because the man inside was waiting. Not waiting for Beckett specifically. Waiting in the way men like Carver Briggs always waited. Inside a closed restaurant at midnight, 2 bodyguards standing behind him, a glass of whiskey on the table, ready for whoever came through that door, with whatever problem they brought. Carver Briggs sat at the last table in the restaurant, against the wall, his back to the corner. The position he always chose, because from there, he could see the entire room, and no one could stand behind him. 2 men stood behind his chair, broad-shouldered, arms crossed over their chests, their faces professionally blank. Carver watched Beckett walk in, and a smile spread across his face, the kind of smile a man wears when he's on his own ground, and knows it. Beckett Ashford. Coming all the way here yourself. Beckett did not answer right away. He walked straight to the table, pulled out the chair across from Carver, sat down, then unbuttoned his suit jacket, slowly, comfortably, as if he were sitting down to dinner at his favorite restaurant, not facing a man who had just sent someone into the home of the woman he was protecting. Carver leaned forward, still smiling. "Your little chef must have been scared. I heard she called you right away. Good reflex. She knows the right man to call." Beckett looked at Carver. No blink, no movement. Then he took his phone from the inside pocket of his jacket, placed it on the table between them with the screen facing Carver, and opened a file. On the screen was a spreadsheet. Dozens of lines, each one a transaction. Account numbers, dates, amounts, shell company names, and at the end of each line, the name of the restaurant receiving the money. Lumiere appeared 17 times. Carver looked at the screen. The smile vanished, not slowly, but instantly, as if someone had switched off a light. "The original is in my lawyer's safe," Beckett said, his voice flat, neither rising nor falling. The same voice he used in the hotel basement when giving orders to his men. The same voice he had used when threatening the head chef in the kitchen. The same voice he used for every serious thing in his life, because Beckett Ashford didn't need to raise his voice to make people afraid. "The copy is at an address where, if I don't call to confirm every 48 hours, it will automatically be sent to the FBI. Carver sat up straighter. His hands rested on the table, and Beckett noticed his fingers tightening slightly, the reflex of a man calculating very quickly in his head. "You have exactly one choice," Beckett continued, still flat, still without emotion, as if he were reading a contract clause. "Leave this city, shut down everything connected to Genevieve Cross, and never appear within my sight again." Carver looked at Beckett, then at the phone on the table, then back at Beckett again. His eyes flicked to the right, quickly, almost invisibly, toward the 2 bodyguards behind him. Beckett did not turn his head, did not look back. He kept his eyes on Carver as he spoke the next sentence, his voice a little softer now, almost a whisper. But in that empty restaurant at midnight, every word was as clear as writing on paper. "The 2 men behind you. I know their names. I know their home addresses. I know both of their bank account numbers. Don't make me remember anything else." The air in the restaurant changed. The 2 bodyguards behind Carver did not move, but the way they did not move said more than any movement could have, because it was the stillness of men who had just realized they weren't as invisible as they thought. Carver looked at Beckett for a long while. He was weighing it, Beckett knew, weighing ego against reason, standing up against staying seated, a fight he would lose against a retreat that would let him live. Then Carver nodded. Once, slowly. He said nothing. Beckett picked up the phone, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, then buttoned his suit jacket again, button by button, slowly, precisely, as if the conversation that had just taken place were nothing more than an ordinary dinner that had ended, and he was preparing to leave the restaurant. He stood. Good. Then he turned and walked toward the door. He did not look back, did not look at the 2 bodyguards, did not look at Carver. His steps were even and slow, sounding against the dark wood floor of the restaurant, past empty tables, past the closed bar, past the main door he had walked through 10 minutes earlier. The door closed behind him. Inside, Carver Briggs remained seated there, the glass of whiskey untouched on the table, the 2 bodyguards silent behind him, and on the tabletop, the fading warmth left by Beckett's phone was the only trace proving he had ever been there. Beckett stepped into the parking lot, opened the car door, sat behind the wheel, and stayed there for a moment before starting the engine. He looked at his hands resting on the steering wheel. They were not shaking. They never shook in front of anyone. But tonight, on the way back to the penthouse where Paige was sleeping on the sofa with her mother's recipe notebook beside her, Beckett knew his hands would shake. Just not yet. That evening, Beckett returned to the penthouse at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. He opened the door gently and stepped inside in silence. The living room was dark, with only the city lights slipping through the balcony glass and casting long streaks across the floor. Paige was still lying on the sofa, in the exact position she had been in when he left, turned slightly to one side, one hand tucked under the pillow, the thin blanket pulled up to her chest, her mother's recipe notebook still resting on the coffee table beside her. She did not move. Her breathing was even and deep, the kind of breathing that belonged to someone too exhausted to dream. Beckett stood there and watched her for a few seconds. Then he took off his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, crossed the living room, stepped into the bathroom, and closed the door. He did not turn on the light right away. He leaned back against the cold tile wall, both hands hanging at his sides, his head tipped back, and breathed out. Heavy, long, as if he had been holding that breath since the moment he walked into Carver's restaurant, and only now was finally allowed to release it. Then his hands began to shake. Not much. Not in a way that meant he had lost control. Just a faint tremor at the tips of his fingers, spreading slowly into his palms, then down to his wrists. He clenched both hands, Open them, clench them again, open them again, as if trying to force them to obey. But they kept shaking. Not because of Carver. He wasn't afraid of Carver Briggs. He wasn't afraid of anyone in the world he had grown up in and ruled for more than 10 years. His hands shook because of something else. Because tonight, his world had touched Paige. The photograph in her apartment was proof. Someone had learned she existed because of him, had gone after her because of him, had stepped into her home and left a wordless threat because of him. And that would not stop with Carver. If he kept her inside his orbit, there would be someone else. There would always be someone else. Because in Beckett Ashford's world, anyone standing too close to him became a target. And he had known that for a long time. Long enough for it to become the reason he kept no one beside him. He turned on the bathroom light. The white glare fell over his face in the mirror. His eyes were tired, faint shadows beneath them. His features harder than usual because his jaw was clenched so tightly he did not realize it until he saw himself. He looked at his own reflection and said, softly, only loud enough for himself to hear, "This is why no one stays." Then he washed his face, turned off the light, left the bathroom, crossed the living room where Paige was still sleeping, entered his bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark until morning came. The next morning, when Paige opened her eyes, sunlight had already slipped through the balcony glass of the penthouse. She sat up, looked around, and needed a few seconds to remember where she was. A strange sofa, a high ceiling, the smell of coffee. Beckett sat at the dining table near the open kitchen, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking out the window. He had changed clothes, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark pants, no suit jacket, no shoes, bare feet on the wooden floor. He looked completely different from Beckett in the buttoned black suit at midnight, completely different from Beckett seated at the head of the table in the basement, ordering a traitor exiled, completely different from Beckett facing Carver Briggs and threatening him in a whisper. He looked like an ordinary man drinking coffee in the morning, but his eyes were not ordinary. His eyes were heavy, carrying something Paige recognized at once because she had seen that look in the mirror many times. The look of someone preparing to say something they knew would change everything. Paige sat down in the chair across from him. Beckett pushed a cup of coffee toward her. She took it, drank a sip, and waited. Beckett set his mug down, looked at her, and spoke. "I'm not a good man in the way you think, Paige." She did not react. She only looked at him and listened. "My family controls things ordinary people should never know about. Hotels, nightclubs, real estate, that's the surface. Beneath that surface is another world, and I stand at the top of that world." He stopped, looked at the coffee mug, then looked back at her. "The photograph in your apartment last night wasn't about Genevieve Cross. It was about my world. Someone came after you because of me, and if you stay close to me, it can happen again." He said the next sentence in a voice Paige had never heard from him before. Not the cold voice of a mafia boss, not the warm voice he used with his mother, but the voice of a man trying very hard to tell the truth, even though he knew that truth could cost him the very thing he wanted most to keep. "If you want to leave after what I just told you, I'll make sure you're safe. No one will bother you again. I promise you that. But I won't pretend to be someone else just to make you stay." The room went silent. Paige did not answer right away. She set the coffee cup down, stood, and walked out onto the balcony. Beckett did not follow. He sat there, watching her back disappear beyond the glass door, and waited. Paige stood on the balcony of the top floor of the Ashford Grand Hotel, looking down at the city stretched below. Far in the distance was the south side where she lived, where her small apartment held her mother's photograph on the kitchen wall, the apartment she did not know when she would be able to return to. She took a long breath, then came back inside. She did not sit down. She stood in front of Beckett, looked down at him, and said, "My mother died when I was very young. She died because there was no money for treatment. My father was gone not long after that because of an accident." She stopped, not to gather emotion, but to choose each word. "I grew up among people with power, but none of them used that power to protect anyone." She looked at Beckett. He looked back at her, not moving, not speaking. "You're dangerous. I know that. Last night I slept on your sofa because someone had gotten into my home, and while your world brought that danger to my door, you were also the only one who came to answer it." She drew another breath. "But last night, when I was afraid, you were the only one who came. And this morning, you're the only one who told me the truth." Silence stretched between them. Not awkward silence, but the silence of two people standing before a threshold, both knowing that once they crossed it, there would be no going back. Then Paige spoke, her voice gentle, clear, and steady. "I'm staying not because you protect me. I'm staying because you gave me the right to choose." Beckett looked at her, and for the first time since he had met Paige in the Ashford Hotel kitchen that day, he did not know what to say, not because he had nothing to say, but because no one had ever said that to him before. No one had ever looked into the darkest part of him and chosen to stay, not out of fear, not out of a need to be protected, but because he had given them the right to leave. He nodded. Once. Slowly. Then he stood, picked up both coffee mugs, walked into the kitchen, and began pouring more. As if that were the most ordinary thing in the world. As if the conversation that had just happened was not the first time in Beckett Ashford's life that he had let someone step past the wall he had built around himself long ago. The final hearing took place 2 weeks after the morning Beckett told Paige the truth at the penthouse dining table. This time, the courtroom was no longer a fight between one side with 3 lawyers and the other side with a girl holding an old notebook. Warren Holt sat beside Paige, calm as always, the case file in front of him 3 times thicker than at the previous hearing, and every page inside it was something Genevieve's legal team did not want to see. Warren Holt stood and began with Clause 12, the very weapon Genevieve had used to sue Paige. He read the clause aloud before the court, slowly, clearly, word by word, then stopped at the 3 most important words no one had noticed before. At Lumiere Facilities. Clause 12 stated that every culinary creation developed at Lumiere Facilities belonged to Genevieve Cross. At Lumiere Facilities, not anywhere else. Warren Holt placed before the court records from the Ashford Grand Hotel, confirming that Paige Mercer had acted under a private, personal invitation from the Ashford family. She had used the hotel kitchen outside of her contracted working hours, utilizing ingredients provided solely by the hotel, meaning the creation was entirely independent of Lumiere, not at Lumiere, not with Lumiere's equipment, not during contracted working hours. Clause 12 did not apply. The 3 attorneys on the other side began to object, but Warren Holt had not stopped. He opened the second part of the file, and this was the part no one in the courtroom had been prepared to hear. Financial reports showed that Lumiere Restaurant had received investments from a shell company throughout the past 3 years, once every quarter, large sums, steady and regular, out of proportion to the scale of business for a restaurant, even a 2-star Michelin restaurant. That shell company, when traced back, led to Carver Briggs, a name the court did not know, but the FBI knew very well. Warren Holt did not accuse Genevieve of money laundering. He only presented the facts. Genevieve had accepted investment money from an unclear source, failed to fully report it in her tax filings, and used that money to operate the restaurant where she claimed complete ownership over every culinary creation inside. He left the court to infer the rest. Genevieve's lead attorney requested a recess to confer with his client. The judge allowed it. 15 minutes later, they returned. The lead attorney stood and said, in a voice that had lost every trace of the confidence he had shown at the first hearing, that the plaintiff was withdrawing the lawsuit. The judge struck the gavel. The case was over. But Genevieve's problems were not. Warren Holt had sent a copy of the financial report to the federal tax authorities before the hearing began, not because Beckett had ordered it, but because it was his legal obligation after discovering signs of tax fraud while collecting evidence for the case. Genevieve Cross would not go to prison because she did not know Carver's investment money was dirty. She took the money because she was greedy, because she wanted to expand, because she wanted one more restaurant carrying her name, and she never asked where the money came from, because the answer did not matter as much as the amount. But she would have to face a federal investigation for tax fraud, and the reputation she had built on someone else's talent would collapse, not because of Paige, but because of her own greed. As for Carver Briggs, he disappeared from the city exactly as Beckett had demanded. The wharf closed permanently 1 week after the night Beckett went there. The shell company was dissolved. The stream of money stopped flowing. No news, no trace, no public explanation. Carver Briggs simply no longer existed in this city, as if he had never been here at all. Paige stepped out of the courthouse close to noon. The sunlight was gentle, the kind of early fall sunlight that did not burn, only warmed the skin just enough to be felt. She stopped on the front steps of the courthouse, in the exact place where she had sat after the first hearing, when she had been alone with the old notebook on her lap and the 3 no's hanging in the record. She stood there, looking at the street ahead, at the cars passing by, at pedestrians walking past. at ordinary life continuing as if nothing had just happened inside the building behind her. She drew in a deep breath, then let it out. Slowly, fully. She did not smile. She did not cry. She only breathed. As if, for the first time in a very long while, she was truly allowed to breathe. 2 days after the final hearing, Paige arrived at the downtown hospital in the late afternoon. She brought a small, insulated container with her. Inside it, a bowl of slow-cooked chicken soup she had tested that morning in the kitchen of the new apartment she had just temporarily rented on the west side, a place no bigger than her old one, but at least it was somewhere whose address no one knew except her and Beckett. Catherine Ashford was sitting propped against the pillows on her hospital bed, her hair neatly brushed, wearing a hospital gown but looking much stronger than the last time Paige had come. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside her. Her complexion had regained a little color, and when Paige walked in, she opened her eyes and smiled in a way Paige was beginning to recognize, the smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly the person she wanted to see. "You're here. I brought you soup, a new recipe. It isn't in the notebook yet." Catherine gave a soft laugh as Paige opened the insulated container and spooned out a small taste for her. She tasted it, nodded, then took another spoonful before setting the spoon down. Then she looked at Paige with the same gaze Paige had first seen in the sitting room on the highest floor of the Ashford Hotel, the gaze of someone searching for something and finding it. "I heard my son gave you a notebook," she said, her voice light, carrying a bit of mischief Paige hadn't expected. Paige looked at her, a little surprised. "I haven't received any notebook, ma'am." Catherine smiled, the smile of someone who knew more than she was saying. "He asked my opinion, asked what he should write inside." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I told him not to write much. You don't need anyone's words. You need blank pages." Paige looked at Catherine, and she understood that a conversation between mother and son had taken place before this, somewhere in this hospital room, when Catherine had held his hand and said the things only a mother could say to her child. Catherine reached out and touched Paige's hand. "Now go home. I think something is waiting for you." Paige held her hand for another moment, then stood, bowed her head slightly, and walked out. On the way back to the new apartment on the west side, Paige didn't think much about what Catherine had said. She thought about the soup, about whether she should add a little thyme or keep it as it was, about the next recipe she wanted to try. But when she stepped onto the front step of her apartment, she stopped. In front of the door was a small box, dark gray cardboard. No ribbon, no card, nothing decorative, just a box placed neatly on the threshold. She bent down, picked it up, and opened the lid. Inside was a notebook. White leather cover, the kind of soft, smooth leather she could feel the moment her fingertips touched it. The specialized recipe notebook she had stood looking at in the window of the high-end kitchen store on Main Street for 2 years every time she passed by. The one she had picked up to check the price, and then put back, because it cost as much as a full week of food. She opened the first page, completely blank, except for one handwritten line in black ink, the lettering neat, unadorned, straight, exactly like someone used to giving orders, not writing letters. "The first page belongs to you. I want to taste the second." Signed underneath with only one letter. B. Paige stood in front of her door, holding the notebook, looking at that line longer than she thought she would. Then she stepped inside, placed the new notebook beside her mother's old, worn one on the kitchen table, picked up the phone, and called the Ashford Grand Hotel. The receptionist answered. Paige spoke in a calm, clear voice. "Tell Mr. Ashford that the second page will be ready tomorrow night." She hung up without waiting for the receptionist to confirm, because she knew the message would reach the right person. The next evening, exactly at 7 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Paige opened it. Beckett stood on the threshold. No suit jacket, no black car, no Neil Grady standing behind him. He wore a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark pants, simple shoes, and in his hand he held a bottle of wine. He had walked here. Paige looked at the wine bottle, then at him. He spoke, his voice light, almost ordinary, almost not the voice of the man the whole city knew better than to stand against. "I brought wine. You cook." And for the first time since this story began, since the Lumiere kitchen at midnight, since the gala night, and the back steps, and the bowl of porridge in the hospital and the courtroom, and the photograph in her home, and the midnight confrontation she knew nothing about, for the first time after all of it, Paige Mercer smiled. Not a polite smile, not a smile for manners, a real smile, from somewhere inside, the kind of smile she thought she had forgotten how to give a long time ago. "Come in," she said. Then she stepped aside, held the door open, and this time, she was the one waiting for him to cross the threshold. That night, after Beckett left, the small West Side apartment returned to its familiar silence. But this time, the silence was not heavy. It was light, like the pause between two notes of music, like the open space before something new begins. On the kitchen table, 2 empty wine glasses sat side by side, next to a clean plate and an empty bottle of wine. Paige finished washing the dishes, wiped her hands on a towel, then sat down at the small wooden table beside the window. In front of her were 2 notebooks. On the left was her mother's old notebook. Its brown leather cover was worn along the spine, the blue ink faded with time. The first 17 pages filled with that slightly slanted handwriting Paige knew by heart, and nearly 100 pages after that written in Paige's own hand. Each page a recipe, each page a date, each page a piece of her life recorded in spices and temperature instead of a diary. On the right was the new notebook. White leather cover, thick pages, the scent of new leather, and on the first page, only one handwritten line in black ink with a single initial signed beneath it. The 2 notebooks lay side by side, the past beside the future, the person who was gone beside the person who had just stepped in. Paige looked at both of them, and for the first time in a very long while, she did not feel that the space between them was an abyss. It was a bridge. She picked up the pen. She opened the new notebook to the second page, the completely blank page, the page Beckett had said he wanted to taste. She placed the pen tip at the upper right corner of the paper and wrote, slowly, stroke by stroke, not in a hurry, not with hesitation, not because she needed to think, but because she wanted to feel every line of ink move across the page, as if this were the first time she had ever written her own name, Paige Mercer. She looked at the words, 2 words, her name, on the blank page of the new notebook, beside her mother's old worn notebook, under the pale yellow light of the little kitchen where she had just cooked dinner for the man who had crossed through his own wall to sit at her table. And for the first time, she did not wonder whether she deserved to put her name here. For years, other people had eaten the food she cooked and received the glory. Other people had stood in front of cameras and said, "I created this," while she stood behind the kitchen door, wiping sweat from her forehead. Other people had written their names on her work, and she had allowed it to happen, day after day, because she had thought that being allowed to stand in a kitchen was enough, that being allowed to cook was enough, that talent would speak her name for her. But talent does not speak for anyone. Talent needs to be named, and that name must be written down by the person who created it. Paige set the pen down, looked at the words one more time, then closed the notebook. She turned off the kitchen light, walked into the small bedroom, and lay down. Tonight, she would be able to sleep. And tomorrow morning, she would begin writing the second page, because from now on, everything she created would carry her name. Paige Mercer's story reminds us of something simple that so many people forget. No one has the right to steal another person's creative identity. The true value of a human being does not lie in degrees hanging on a wall or in social status, but in what that person's hands and heart create every day. And sometimes, the greatest strength is not power or money, but the courage to stand up and say, "This is mine." If Paige's story touched you in any way, please like and share this video so more people can hear it. Tell us how this story made you feel in the comments below. We would truly love to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the captivating stories we share every day, because the best part is always still ahead. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.